All right, we are live. Brian Furey, welcome to the Future of Fitness, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Obviously, doing this in person and doing it with someone in Whitefish is really, really cool. And thank you, Morgan, and the Deliver Fund folks for letting us use the studio today. So I'm trying to give some backstory. I met you, like 2-3 months ago, right? Yeah. I was at the Venture to Build event, which is a local event here for entrepreneurs and business owners. And I got to see you speak, dude, and I was pretty blown away with, your presentation, what you guys are doing at Nature's Fynd. And then, of course, we got to know each other, took a couple turns on the ski mountain and had a couple beers and decided we definitely need to do a recording. So I'm going to let you explain what you guys are doing. It's fascinating how the product developed. The amount of funding you guys have gotten is pretty darn impressive. And I think it's going to have a lot of impacts on how we look at our food supply moving forward, but I don't want to spoil it all. I'll let you tell the story. So let's start with this, Brian. If you don't mind, give us a little bit of your backstory. How'd you get to Nature's Fynd? And then we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, man.
Exciting to be here. And I always love telling the story about Nature's Fynd. I think now that I've been there 6 years, sometimes I have to pinch myself, right? And remind myself of how cool the background story is and what we're trying to do. So I appreciate the opportunity to review it and share with your listeners as well. So let's see, my background, I have a background in biochemistry, went to school at Montana State University. And when I was in school, I did an internship where I was working on natural products that were being used in vaccine adjuvants. And it was like this really cool compound that came from a tree bark in South America. And it was sustainably harvested, and it had this immune response in humans. And the other cool part about it is that it couldn't be synthesized by humans. So it had to be harvested in a sustainable way. And so I started working as a chemist and was supporting some of the regulatory filings and the scale up. And that really sparked my interest in the natural world. And since then, I've had roles that have ranged from, utilizing natural products like that in drugs and pharmaceuticals to making bio-based chemicals, films, adhesives, biodegradable water treatment chemicals, things that went into everyday products that you've used, dish detergent, shampoo, soap, all kinds of personal care products. And how I got into Nature's Fynd is at one of the previous companies, startups that I worked at, a board member called me after that company had kind of dissolved and sold off some of its IP. And he said, "Hey, I had this conversation with a guy at a barbecue in Big Sky, Montana. And he said he's found this fungi that he wants to turn into food. And we have no money, but it's this crazy project. And I'm curious if you can help us." And so I'm like always into, new ideas, and especially with that natural product kind of baseline, I was kind of all in. And what I started doing before we raised money was building the concepts of how to prove that it's safe to consume and how we're a regulatory pathway to work with the FDA and global regulatory bodies to get it approved. And so that was in 2017, now 2024. So 6-7 years later.
Yeah. Awesome, man. There's a key part that I think you skipped, and it's a bit of a segue, but Galande skiing.
Yeah.
I learned this about you too. We're going to get back to all the Nature's Fynd stuff, but we were on the chairlift and you were explaining this to me, and I was blown away that this is something that existed and that you do. So maybe explain to people really quick, like what that is, and why it's so interesting and kind of gnarly.
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up in Montana, always outdoors, always looking for the next thrill. Growing up skiing, was always looking to, get bigger air, go faster. And a lot of my friends who are former ski racers, they were doing this thing called Galande ski jumping. And what it is it's a Nordic ski jump. So in the Olympics, you see the Nordic ski jumping where they're up on the big platform and they go down and it's ski flying, right?
Yeah.
And they go sometimes, I think I've seen up to like 500-600 feet distance. And what Galande is just taking a normal pair of alpine skis, so a fixed heel, and building a jump on the mountain and doing that same ski flying. You do wear the speed suit. And so my friends were doing this. There's long traditions of Galande skiing, especially in Montana. There used to be a handful of jumps. Whitefish used to have a jump. The two champions of Galande skiing are from Whitefish, Rolf and Eric Wilson. Yeah. And I believe they both live here now. But it's just this like totally fun thing. And I was never very good at it, but loved the camaraderie. And we would tour around the U.S. and there was like 4 or 5 jumps a year. So it was a good time.
Yeah.
And never got injured.
Yeah, I was going to say, I started watching YouTube videos after you mentioned it to me. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole. And it's not something I want to pick up at 47. Let's put it that way. I think it's a good idea. Okay, so getting back to Nature's Fynd, thanks for that. I would imagine, in my small exposure to the FDA, they're not easy to work with, right? So, as you started, well, let me back up. Let's dive into the discovery of the fungus, right? Because this is a pretty crazy story. Everyone obviously knows Yellowstone now due to that damn TV show, but it's something that's a kind of a scientific marvel, really, and how they discovered it. And then I'm curious too, when they did discover it, did they immediately think like, oh, this could be food? How did that whole thing unfold?
Yeah, absolutely. So our scientific founder, Dr. Mark Kozabel, was working under a NASA and NSF grants through Montana State University when he was getting his PhD. So getting his PhD in microbiology. And under this grant, they were looking for something that could grow in extreme environments. And NASA was looking for something that could grow in space, either for travel or colonization purposes. And there were 2 objectives. Those 2 were either looking for something that could produce fuel or produce food, and high protein food specifically. And so, there's all kinds of amazing microorganisms in the park, many that haven't been discovered yet. And so what he found was this filamentous fungi that was in one of the hot springs. And the hot springs are an extreme environment, right? People think, yeah, it's hot, right? And so an extremophile is what they're classified as, microorganisms that can grow there, is that these extremophiles can withstand high heat. Well, there's also a whole bunch of chemistry that's going on in those springs as well, because you have all that water that's coming up, from below the surface, and it's picking up all kinds of different minerals, right? And these minerals are beneficial to the growth of not only microorganisms, but also all cellular function, right? And what this fungi that he discovered, what it would do is it would live off the minerals in the water, and also anything that would blow in or fall into essentially the spring, right? And so a lot of fungi can easily adapt to what's available to them. And so what we found is that you can feed it all kinds of different things, right? For different feedstocks is what we call it, right? So you could feed it, waste biomass, anything from, leftover corn husks to spent brewer's grains to, purified forms of sugar, for example. And what it does is, depending on what you feed it, it'll produce different macronutrients. So if you feed it something that has a higher fat content, like biomass, it'll produce more oil, and it could produce oil for fuel, right? But what we do is we feed it more of the building blocks to make protein, more nitrogen and carbon and oxygen, which is essentially protein. And what we see is it produces about 50% protein. Yeah. So what Dr. Kozabel did was he's like, hey, this can be that food, right, that we're talking about. It grows in about 4 days, so it's extremely rapid, right? So it could be a great candidate for NASA for them to use as a food substance and grow in space.
That's incredible. Yeah. I mean, this type of research, is it something like, are they constantly looking for new environments to find this type of fungus? Like, was it a stroke of luck, or was it something that is constantly being looked for like all over the globe? Like, how big is this type of research?
Yeah, I mean, it's not huge research, but it's building, right? There's this focus, becoming a more focused lens on the world of mycology and fungi. And what we're seeing is, it's really cool, is that fungi is actually its own kingdom, right? So people kind of lump it into the plant kingdom. However, it is its own kingdom, separate from animals. And so what's cool is that it's actually, fungi are more closer to animals than they are to plants, right? There's more homology of like genes and how like fungi consume their feed. It's more similar to animals. And so what people are seeing is that you're seeing like high protein, you're seeing complete proteins that are highly digestible, that are more similar to animal-based proteins than they really are to plant proteins. And so what it's doing is like providing this wealth of more funding and information. And I don't know what the current metrics are on how many fungi might exist, like the estimate, but it's like millions of different species, and we've only really discovered a fraction of those. And so many things in our daily life come from fungi, right? Fermentation products, beer, sourdough bread, that's all fungi. Antibiotics, right? From fungi, right? Penicillin is the first antibiotic discovered from a fungal species. And so, what we think about is like, how do we embrace the research community? How do we provide more funding to the research community so that we can find things that could be breakthrough from a food perspective, from a drug perspective, from environmental remediation, which fungi are good at as well. So there's just a huge wealth of things that could be explored.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. And I think you and I talked about this too. Isn't the the largest known living organism fungi? It's like in Oregon or something like that. Yeah. So it's the mycelium. Yep. Which is essentially the root structure of a fungal organism, right? So most people think fungi, they think mushrooms, right? What you see in the grocery store, like your cremini mushroom or oyster mushroom. What that is actually just a structure of the organism, the total organism, and it's the fruiting body. And so in some fungi, they do produce the mushroom, some they don't, right? And so that mycelium is in every fungi, but for many you don't eat it, but for some you do. And so for our organism, so we call it Fusarium flavolapis is the Latin name for the species, and flavolapis is Latin for Yellowstone. Okay. And what Fusarium flavolapis does is it just produces the mycelium, so that root structure, and that's what we grow in Nature's Fynd. Yeah. Awesome, man. Super interesting. I mean, and how does the process work with like growing the fungi and then actually making it into a food? Like, what does that process look like? Yeah, absolutely. So I want to note is that we took one sample from Yellowstone Park, right? So we don't need to keep continuing going back to Yellowstone to harvest it. And what's really cool is it's, again, very similar to other fermentation products that we consume. You really just need one small amount of it to start with, and then you can propagate into perpetuity, which is incredible. And so we have these, like what we call different generations of the original. So essentially you take the first one, and you propagate it into, hundreds of samples. And then we use a new sample every single time for every day's production. So what we do is we take one of those samples and we essentially grow it in a large fermenter. And we feed it all the things that it likes to consume, like things that we studied the chemistry of that hot spring, as well as what generally fungi like to consume. They like to eat sugar. They like to eat
carbohydrates, right? So they can convert that into protein and fat and fiber. And we grow that mycelium in a tray. And so that tray creates a lot of the texture and the bite that give it very similar consistency to like muscle fiber, right? So you think about this filamentous style organism, microorganism, the fungi, and what it does is it creates these fibers very similar to muscle. And so when you bite it, it has that texture that's very rewarding, right? When you eat a piece of meat like a steak, right? When you take that bite, it's part of that like feedback loop that is like rewarding, not only the flavor and the salt and the fat, right? But also that bite, which people enjoy. So you get some of that from that filamentous structure. So we grow it in these trays, and we can grow it to the ceiling essentially, and they're just stacked. And then we harvest it after 4 days, and we steam it, and then we give it a quick wash, and then we turn it into amazing foods. And so at that point, once we create the ingredient, we call it Phi protein. So you have the organism itself, which is Fusarium flavolapis. And then once it turns into the ingredient through that process, we call it Phi protein.
Yeah.
So FY, like from Yellowstone.
Got it.
And then our name, Nature's Fynd. So FYND.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the process of getting through the FDA, I mean, I know that's your wheelhouse, right?
Yeah.
Difficult? Easy? Somewhere in between?
Yeah. So to me, it's fun. It's a lot of fun. Okay. Right. What the regulatory world for me and why it's exciting is that you have to have a strong understanding of science. You have to have a strong understanding of how we may interact with a new food. And when I say interact with, like, what kind of foods is it going to be in? How much you're going to eat? What are we going to turn it into? Right. And all of those things can have impacts on the safety profile. And you add in like this science, this like exposure, this toxicology, public policy, regulatory science, and also the opportunity to communicate. Right. And so working with the FDA, yeah, they seem like this, large government institution, but it's full of curious, thoughtful, well-trained scientists.
Cool.
Right. And so one thing that I do as a regulatory professional, and a lot of folks do, is have like a consultation meeting, right? To introduce them to new concepts, new ideas, right? And they're very curious, right? And so you have these conversations with them that are like this deep dive into the science and how you're going to show the FDA or regulatory body that these new ingredients are safe to consume. And I think starting with that and having that relationship built goes such a long way. And of course, there's going to be things that come up as you put in your application that are going to be, you didn't discuss in the consultation meetings. But at that point, right, there's opportunities to have further discussions that you can clarify, what exactly are they looking for that's going to be beneficial to them for them to be able to make a decision. Yeah.
Well, everything at the end of the day is a people business, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why is this so significant of a fine? I mean, I guess what I'm looking at is like, I think everyone's pretty aware that there's problems with our food supply, whether it's the quality of the food, ultra processed foods. People say we have 60 good years of agricultural left in this country, right? Before we completely waste the soil. So there's some obvious problems, but how do you define the problem of our food security, I guess, for lack of a better term? And like, why is this so significant to that problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's three things to touch on there. There's the food security piece, there's the sustainability and the nutrition. Yep. Right. And food security, I mean, we see so much that there's issues with our food supply. Right. It was exemplified when we went through COVID. right? Just the supply chains alone. Like people were running out of food left and right, or you could just get a certain kind of food, right? We don't need to get into like supply chain and toilet paper, but the food was issues, right? We saw so many stories of food being wasted, right? While on the other hand, you have people that are hungry. And that was exemplified during COVID, but it happens every single day.
Yeah.
Right. And the amount of waste that comes from food is incredible. And when that gets into the sustainability conversation, right, it's like, how can we just improve that piece, that we're just landfilling a significant portion of our food, and how can we improve on the supply chains? But also, how do we identify that things can be a little bit more local and scaled down? Because I think some of that was obvious during COVID, is that you saw that there are farmers that had hundreds of tons, thousands of tons of food, right? And they had no way to get it into a small package for a consumer, because they were like maybe only doing it for industrial size or scale, right? So for people to retool, it became really difficult. And so with Fynd protein, right, we can produce that at small scale, at large scale. We can tailor it to a lot of different occasions and a lot of different foods. And what makes it so unique is that right now, our products, we make sausage, cream cheese, and yogurt. And what that does is it demonstrates that it can be an alternative protein that can span across both dairy and meat alternatives. But we're just getting started on like the food categories. We can dry it down. We can make pasta. We can make flour out of it to turn it into bread. We can make drinks, like high protein drinks, right? And so what we could do is tailor based on our food security issues to make foods that can be available and readily available to consumers.
Oof, that's amazing. Yeah. So you mentioned the product line. I mean, talk to us about like the production, like where are you guys doing it now? I mean, what do you see as far as the future of how it's produced? Is it produced here in the United States? Okay. Yeah. So tell us about the production.
Yeah, absolutely. So we currently produce it in the US, in Chicago. We've got a team in Chicago, about 150 people. And we are building a second facility in the US. So working with some partners to do that. We are exploring outside the US. So a little bit back to the regulatory piece. So there's the US, there's the FDA, but we look at this, it's not a solution just for the US, it's a solution globally. And so with the regulatory approvals, so we've received regulatory approvals in not only the US, but Canada, Singapore, and then some smaller countries, Japan, UAE, the Cayman Islands.
Nice.
And we continue to work on additional approvals, places like the EU, which the EU is like, in terms of the regulatory world, is like the gold standard for their review, their scientific review. And so that one actually, being that it is the most robust, it takes probably the longest in the world. And so to answer your question, yeah, we're in the US right now, but we're very quickly looking to expand across the globe.
And when you talk about like the cost of production, I mean, is it on par with kind of our normal food production costs that we know now, or is it cheaper, more expensive? Do you think it will get cheaper over time? Like, what about the cost of all of it?
Yeah. So costs right now, when you look at it compared to, let's just look at two categories, like plant-based. So you're looking at like pea protein and soy protein.
Yep.
Those products are usually a concentrate or an isolate, right? So when you're eating a lot of plant-based foods these days, you'll see on the label like a pea protein or soy protein concentrate or isolate. And so what that is, just the protein from those plants. And what you see in a lot of those types of foods is that you have to add a lot of things back in. So you have to add in fiber, you have to add in fat, you have to add in things that do the binding to make it stick together like a burger. What's different about Fynd protein is that we use that whole mycelium from the fungus. And what it's got is protein, fiber, fat, and it's got all these texture characteristics, right? And so when you talk about the cost, you have to look at more than just the ingredient itself. You have to look at like the whole product that you're making, which gets into a little bit of like the processed foods discussion and, you know, some of the discussion these days about ultra processed foods that are not great to your health, right? Where we can do it with less ingredients, less processing, and similar to some animal products, right? Sure, if you're just having a burger, right, a beef burger, like people usually are adding ingredients to it, right? Most people that consume burgers are from a fast food restaurant. There's a whole bunch of stuff in that.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's not just beef, right? So when we talk about the costs, we look at that whole picture. And right now, we're about on par with both of those plant-based and animal-based and looking to improve as we continue to scale.
Yeah. Awesome, man. I mean, one of the things that when I heard you talk originally, Brian, was that blew me away was the fundraising that you guys have done in such a short period of time. I mean, you know, I come from the fitness and wellness industry and I don't hear these numbers very often. So maybe give us some insights into how quickly you guys were able to raise, why you think that happened, kind of the process of that. And then, give us more insights. It's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the company as itself before kind of that grant money and that research dollars. So that was the first phase, was the research in Yellowstone with the grant money. So that was about 2012 through 2018. And we raised our Series A in 2018. And what that was, okay, you have the concept. We think you guys can prove that you can scale it, that it's safe, that you can get regulatory approvals. And with that, we had a couple investors and from the food industry, right? So some big agricultural backing. And we ran with that for about a year. And then we went through the FDA, what it's called is the GRAS process. So generally recognized as safe. And then we launched in early 2021. So it took us about 18 to 24 months before we had our first product launch. And it was really cool. You talk about startup world and being pushed and the speed to do things. On February 14th, so Valentine's Day of 2020. So right before COVID really was taking hold.
Yep.
On 60 Minutes, Anderson Cooper and Bill Gates were talking about Nature's Fynd. Bill Gates is one of our backers through Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And he's eating our food on 60 Minutes, which these were like prototypes that we were making on the bench. And we just looked at this and we said, this is a huge opportunity for us. We have to launch products. It doesn't matter if what's going to happen in the world. We just have to buckle down and do it. And what we did and we had about 4 months before we had them on shelf and we're providing it to consumers, but we just had to go crunch time, right? You don't have those types of opportunities very often and you got to run with it. And so what we did is we launched both our breakfast sausage and cream cheese to show that versatility. And I mean, we got rave reviews, right? Awesome. And so with that, we raised a Series B in middle to late 2020. So again, right in the middle of like our first understandings of COVID and coronavirus. And what our investors were seeing is this food insecurity, this supply chain issue, right? And they're looking at this opportunity that is 5-protein in Nature's Fynd. And it's saying, look, this can grow rapidly. We can deploy it quickly. And it's nutritious. You know, it's good for your health. And the regulatory clearances are already there. And so we're able to gather a lot of funding in a short period of time. Also around that time, you also saw a lot of other alternative proteins raising money, right? And there was a ton of money that was available as well.
It was crazy.
I mean, venture money was like going out the door.
The good old days.
Right? Yeah. And we didn't stop at the Series B, so we raised a Series C as well. And so at that point, that was in 2021, we already had products that were on shelf. We already had some, good information about consumers, and we call our consumers the optimistic advocates that want to buy this. They want to see it, right? They're curious. They'll buy it again.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's nice. So you have some runway.
We do.
Yeah. That must feel good.
Yeah.
Brian, I know you're not a nutritionist. We talked about this, but give us some ideas, like, as it compares to, the normal proteins in at least our Western diets. Like, what is the nutritional value of this? How does it stack up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think despite, not being a classical trained nutritionist or dietitian, it is one of the exciting things about Phi and Phi protein is to have something, and as I talked about, is we eat that whole fungus, right? It's not further processed. And it's about 50% protein and then 35% fiber and about 10% fat, healthy fats. And so what it does is like this kind of powerhouse macro ingredient. And the protein we talk about, and I'm sure, in the fitness world, people talk about protein quality a lot.
Yep.
Right. And so you have a lot of people eating like whey or casein protein. That's the base of most protein supplements, powders that people are eating and consuming. And the protein quality, what it is looking at the amino acids, right? And people talk about essential amino acids and branched chain amino acids. And there are 9 essential amino acids that not only are essential, but essential in these kind of golden ratios. And those ratios are kind of curious, as it's compared to the diet for a 2 to 5-year-old. Why do we do that comparison? And there's other comparisons, but that is like generally the most accepted, is because that's, as a growing human, the time that is crucial in your life to have those right amino acids in the right ratios. And so what you have is what's called the PDCAS, the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, which is one of a couple ways to measure the quality of the protein. And with that, you have your whey and casein protein as your gold standard. So what those score is a 1. So it's essentially 100% digestible. And in these studies that you do, and you can do modeling both outside an animal or in an animal, right? So you can use rodents, or you can do some of this like digestibility modeling, and which we've done both. And what it shows is that the Phi protein is a 0.92, so 92% digestible. And just, I said like whey and casein are a 1, but to put it in perspective of other foods, other proteins, things like ground beef are 92%, 0.92. Things like, we were talking about pea protein concentrates, it's about 89-90% digestible. And then if you go down to things like nuts, like peanuts, right, which sometimes you see protein claims that are on nuts, and good source of protein claims, those can be anywhere from like 50 to 70% digestible. Now, it kind of sounds bad, right? Okay, so you only are really ingesting 50% in nuts. However, that other protein that's there, that's not digestible, kind of acts as fiber.
Yep.
And in Phi, we have 35% fiber, which includes beta-glucan fiber. And what we're seeing in some of these fungal protein studies that some universities are doing and some other companies are funding, and we're starting to work into some of these like human clinical trials to look at the benefits of consuming fungal proteins, is that fiber is helping to reduce cholesterol, especially LDL, and it's helping with metabolic health. So what that fiber does in the fungi is it's good for satiety. So it makes you feel fuller faster. And so you're not overeating, and it kind of slows your digestion down. And so what they're seeing is that with that slowing of digestion is that blood insulin levels are moderating, and you're not seeing sugar spikes, which is incredible, like potential benefit of consuming these fungal proteins. The third part of it, we talked about the digestibility of the protein and the quality of the protein, is that there's been some recent studies about muscle building when people eat fungal proteins versus casein and whey.
Okay.
And they're seeing higher muscle building and muscle synthesis from eating fungal proteins than from eating whey and casein. And it's like, obviously a lot more needs to be done before there's, claims that can be made that are on pack and generally accepted by like the FDA, which there's a process to get those approved. But it's really exciting, kind of cutting edge beginning research that people are looking at these things and seeing benefits, not only from just feeling full to metabolic disorders, to heart health, to muscle building.
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, I think the quality and amount of protein that people have in their diets, is really starting to come in our life for a couple of reasons. I mean, you look at what are claimed as or named food deserts, right? So a lot of these places where they don't have access to a lot of fresh vegetables and fruits, high quality proteins, things like that. That's really important for those people. And also we're starting to see as the rise of, a common topic on this show is the GLP-1, Ozempics, things like that, like these miracle weight loss drugs, right?
Right.
But what happens, on the effects, I don't even think they're called side effects, they're just effects, but people aren't getting enough protein. Right? They stop eating enough. They don't really know how to eat correctly, so they don't get enough protein. They start losing muscle mass. So as we kind of go into this new era of the GLP-1 era, like that's really critical too. And just giving access to high quality protein is really important. So that's super exciting, man.
Yeah.
I love it. Give me an idea, like, where do you think this is going, right? Like 10 years from now, I mean, you guys have some direct to consumer products. Do you think this is ever going to get to a point? Are you going to be like licensing this to food companies? Like, let's put a timestamp on it. 10 years from now, Brian, like where do you think this is going to be?
Yeah. Well, I see a lot of opportunity, and, there was, I'd say, a spike in excitement about alternative proteins right around COVID, right? I think there was people had a lot of time to kind of slow down and think about food, think about diet, think about, the supply chain issues as they can't get, what they used to be able to just go to the grocery store and it's just immediate, right? And so people started to become more aware of food, more aware of diet. And what I mentioned it before is the optimistic advocate is what we call our consumers.
Yeah, I love that.
And it's kind of fun there's really three reasons why we see consumers that are interested, and it's growing. And so those three reasons are people are looking for alternative proteins for a few different reasons, right? And so some are about sustainability, right? That's awesome, right? Thinking about climate change. You have people that are looking at it from an animal welfare perspective. And then the third group is you're looking at people that from a health perspective, and you immediately think kind of these optimistic advocates are more of like millennial, Gen Z, more people that are more open to new ideas. But we're also seeing is a larger demand from boomers, right? They're thinking about their health, right? They're going to the doctor and they're saying your cholesterol's high and you can't eat 5 burgers a week, right? You've got to find something that's different. And so as those optimistic advocates, that idea expands for whatever reason, right? Is that people are changing their diet and thinking about, okay, how do I reduce my meat intake? And we call them flexitarians. And those flexitarians are eating, one less piece of meat per eating occasion. Like, so they might not eat meat for breakfast, or they might have meatless Mondays, or, do like a vegetarian or vegan January, right? And some of these trends are really taking hold, and people are like, hey, I don't have to have, red meat 5 times or even more times per week. So with that expanding consumer base and interest, I really see that, yeah, there's been some ups and downs in the alternative protein market, but it's going to continue to rise, right? There's no doubt that we cannot feed the world on our current diets, not on a Western diet, right? And especially in countries that are rapidly expanding, India and China and some Asian countries, right? Like, as the GDP goes up, there's more demand for meat, and the world can't supply it, right? Not only from what's currently available, but from just a climate and sustainability perspective, the world can't supply that amount of meat-based foods. And what we see is that with Fynd protein, it can be rapidly deployed, right? And it can grow in less than a week.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
How is it? I think about it, I put myself in your shoes, and it must be really cool to wake up every morning knowing that you're like going at a problem that's so critical. So not just like, your local community, but like the human race, right? Like, this is a big deal. Like, explain to me, how is the culture in your company and like the leadership, like, is everybody, yeah, it must be a very optimistic, positive environment, I would only imagine. But explain it. Like, how's it like going to work every day with this team, and what are they like?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's difficult, right?
Sure.
And I think people think about startups and how much effort it can take. And to me, the joys and the excitement of being in a startup is making decisions without 100% perfect, complete information.
Yeah.
Right. And you got to make a decision at that time with what you know. And our leadership team really embraces that. And so we have, like, our CEO is Thomas Jonas. And he is embracing of a culture that we're changing the world. And it's never easy to change the world, right? Yeah. And it's going to be messy, and we're going to make mistakes. And so when we embrace that these mistakes are going to happen, but we join together as a team to solve them, we have such a strong connection to people within the organization cross-functionally, right? And so they see that, well, there was a mistake, by maybe the R&D team or the regulatory team or the marketing team, right? But then there's a support that comes in that's like, hey, let's get through this. Let's figure out how we do it better and not make that mistake again and move forward.
Yeah. Awesome, man.
Yeah.
As an industry, and when I talk about that, like fitness, health, and wellness kind of is all coming into one industry now. Mm-hmm. It's merging. But what can we do to help you? Like, what do you need right now as a business, as, where you guys are at? Like, if people want to reach out and they want to talk to you, like, what do you want to hear from them about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot more conversation to be had about the nutrition and the benefits. And especially in the fitness world, where it's uber important, right? Is nutrition is so important, right? And there's a lot of wonderful research that exists, and there's some research that maybe be, less than stellar. And then there's so many emerging new things, right? And so I think in the fitness community, and where Fynd protein can support, or vice versa, is thinking about what other studies could be done, right? There's already, like I talked about, some of those those granular kind of starts to things that could be really impactful in the fitness world. And you have a lot of folks in the fitness world that are also some of these optimistic advocates, right? And they're like, how do I reduce my animal protein intake or be more sustainable? And this could be an option. So I think there's, what we're looking for is partnerships on like clinical studies and exercise studies and those kind of things where, somebody may be consuming Fynd protein compared to somebody consuming like a whey protein based protein drink or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. Well, yeah, I can definitely think of a handful of people that would love to get their hands on this.
And it'd be super fun too to have, there are athletes that are like, hey, I want to try that as like the core of my diet.
Yeah.
And see how it might impact, right? And on my team, I have a wonderful dietitian that she can help like put together some meal plans and ideas of how they're not going to be, losing out on their key nutrition, but where we can match like protein levels, we can match fiber levels, we can match, carbohydrates and whatever they're looking for.
That's incredible, man. I mean, as you're talking, I just imagine this world where everything's like food supply is hyper localized, right? Mm-hmm. Very adaptable, customizable, I guess, to the nutrition needs of the community. And that can be anywhere. I mean, it's the problem is so complicated. Like you mentioned, I think the statistic I heard is like 50% of all food is thrown away, right, in the United States. And yet there's people starving all over the planet. Like that's a problem, right? So we just need to figure some things out and come together. So really appreciate the work you're doing, Brian. If people want to get a hold of you or learn more, like is there any places you specifically want them to go online?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Nature's Fynd. We're on all the social media.
Love those links. Yep.
And it's Fynd is Fynd. And then website is naturesfynd.com. But yeah, I can be found, LinkedIn. I can share my email. And yeah, I think we're very curious, right? We're optimistic advocates, and we're curious to continue advancing the research that we do, continuing advancing the product. And I think also helpful is like going out and buying it, right? And so all our foods are available in all the Whole Foods, Sprouts Markets, Fresh Time. And so we're in about 1,000 stores right now. And yeah, go out and try it. We just launched yogurt in January. We have 3 flavors and they're wonderful. We have vanilla, peach, and strawberry, and they're low on sugar and high on protein, and they're really good.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I think the thing with getting new products out to the market too is people, once they understand the story, they have a connection to it. Right. And then we're apt to buy it and support it. So, getting on podcasts, as this is no Joe Rogan here, but, getting on stuff like this and continuing to tell a story is really critical what you guys have, because it's amazing. So great job, Brian.
Yeah, thanks.
Great description, great background, great, just laying out the whole vision and story was excellent. So thank you for coming on, man. It's always a pleasure to see you and talk to you. And ladies and gentlemen, Brian Furey.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Just on one closing,
please.
I want to bring it full circle as we talked about the origin story with NASA. And 2 summers ago, Phi was grown in the International Space Station.
Awesome.
And it grew totally fine in zero gravity. So it was really cool.
Yeah. You guys are an intergalactic company.
Yeah. Now, none of us got to go to space to grow it. But right. Yeah. It was a cool project.
Right on, man. That's cool. Very exciting.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Let's go skiing.
Thank you, Eric. All right. Cool. Thanks.